Good. I have the full transcript. Now I'll write a completely new story applying the formula. I noticed the story is set in Montana, with Canadian-specific elements missing. Let me now write the new story adapted for a Canadian audience. BC, Alberta setting, Canadian financial, legal context, Canadian cultural references. I caught it in the way he tilted his head when he thought I wasn't looking. Not curiosity, calculation. I chose to act before it was too late. My future son-in-law first asked about the property on a Sunday afternoon in October, standing at my kitchen window with a coffee mug in his hand, watching the tree line where our acreage ended. He had the kind of smile that arrived half a second too fast, the kind that never quite settled into the eyes. So, how far back does it go, Margaret? He kept his voice easy, the way people do when they're trying to make a question sound like conversation. To that ridge? 40 years as a Crown prosecutor had made me very good at noticing when a question was something other than what it appeared to be. To the creek, I said, about 22 acres from the house. He nodded, sipping his coffee. Beautiful. Property like this, out here near Kelowna, must be worth something. There it was. The question beneath the question. It's home, I said simply. My daughter Claire appeared from the hallway, bright and laughing, the way 3, 4-year-olds are when they're newly in love and believe everything is going according to plan. She'd inherited her father's dark eyes and my habit of tilting her head when she was deciding whether to trust someone. At that moment, the tilt was in his direction, not mine. "Mom, don't let her intimidate you," she said to Ethan, leaning against his arm. "She spent 40 years cross-examining liars. It's a reflex." Ethan laughed. Exactly the right number of teeth. "I'd expect nothing less," he said. I smiled and said nothing. In the Crown's office, we had a saying. The smartest witnesses are the ones who wait for more evidence before they commit. I was not yet ready to commit. My husband Thomas died on a Thursday 4 years ago. He was 64 years old and was trimming the apple trees at the edge of the property when his heart gave out without warning. I found him in the long grass with the pruning shears still in his hand, the afternoon light turning everything gold around him. It is the kind of image that never leaves you. Thomas had been a civil engineer for 38 years. He'd started as a junior drafter at a small firm in Kelowna and built it into one of the most respected structural engineering practices in British Columbia. He was the kind of man who thought 10 steps ahead, who kept meticulous records, who never bought something he hadn't spent 6 months researching. He drove the same truck for 12 years. He wore the same 3 pairs of shoes in rotation. The one extravagance of his life was this property, 22 acres of orchard and forest outside Kelowna, with a view of Okanagan Lake that made your breath catch every single morning. When he died, I thought the grief would be the hardest thing I'd ever survive. I had been wrong about that. Ethan Cole came into our lives at Thanksgiving. Claire had called the week before, her voice carrying that frequency I hadn't heard since she was 16, and had fallen into her first serious crush. "Mom, I need you to be open-minded. He's different from anyone I've brought home before. He's thoughtful, and Mom, just be open-minded." He arrived at the door in a charcoal blazer that was too carefully chosen to be casual, carrying a bottle of BC Okanagan wine that told me he'd done some research. He had dark hair, a firm handshake, and the particular confidence of a man who had rehearsed his impression many times. "Margaret," he said my name like he'd known me for years. "Claire has told me everything about you, the prosecutor years, this incredible property. I've been looking forward to meeting you." The meal was easy. He asked thoughtful questions about my career, about Thomas's engineering work, about the history of the property. He made Claire laugh. He helped clear the table without being asked. It was only on the porch afterward, watching the lake turn orange in the November sunset, that he asked about the boundary lines. By Christmas, he'd proposed. By February, they'd set a date, July 12th, right here on the property. And by March, Ethan had asked about the land 4 more times, always casually, always a different angle. "How much acreage again? Does it run to the Myra Canyon Trail? Have you ever had it assessed? British Columbia real estate has appreciated so much, especially Okanagan Corridor." Each time, I gave him a short answer and changed the subject. Each time, I noticed the way his eyes moved while I spoke not at me, but past me, at the room, at the shelves, at the framed photographs of Thomas at job sites, at the faint outline of the filing cabinet in the study. Thomas used to say that the most dangerous witnesses in court were the ones who kept looking at the exits. The call I needed to make was to my friend Patricia, a retired family law judge who now consulted on estate matters. We'd worked together on dozens of cases over 20 years. If anyone would listen without immediately assuming I was a paranoid widow, it was Patricia. She answered on the second ring. "Patricia, I need to talk to you about Claire's fiancé." A pause. "Tell me." I did. The repeated questions, the inventory-like gaze, the way he steered conversations toward estate planning, asset management, the value of property in the Okanagan. His job, a financial advisor with a firm in Vancouver I'd never heard of, despite knowing the financial sector reasonably well. "How long has Claire known him?" Patricia asked. 7 months. They're engaged. Another pause. "That's fast." "I know. Margaret." Her voice settled into the register she used when she was about to say something important. In 35 years on the bench, every financial exploitation case I've seen involving a surviving spouse had one thing in common. The predator always found them through the grieving child. It's the access point. I looked out the window at Thomas's apple trees, bare in the March cold. "What do I do?" "You let me make some calls." Quietly. "If this man is who he says he is, we'll know in a week. And you can relax." "If he isn't," she stopped. "I have contacts at RCMP Financial Crimes. I'll reach out carefully. In the meantime, act normal. Don't sign anything. Don't give him documents." "And Claire?" "Not yet. Not until we have something concrete. You know how this works. You've prosecuted enough of these cases." I did know. Evidence first, emotion second. "Call me Friday," Patricia said. I didn't wait for Friday. I spent 2 evenings going through Thomas's filing cabinet, something I'd been avoiding for 4 years because opening those drawers meant confronting how much he'd thought about the future, how carefully he'd prepared for it. The documents were meticulous. Thomas had structured everything through a family trust. The year before he died, a quiet decision he'd made after watching his business partner go through a brutal divorce that stripped the man's estate nearly clean. He'd sat me down at this same kitchen table and explained it with the same focus he brought to load-bearing calculations. "The trust protects Claire's inheritance," he'd said. "No spouse can touch it without her explicit written consent and a full legal review. It takes 3 signatures, hers, yours, and the trustee." Our estate lawyer was the trustee. A woman named Grace Hendricks, who had known Thomas since they were both articling students, and who had the disposition of someone who had spent her career saying no to bad ideas. I called Grace the next morning. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said. Something in her tone made me still. "What do you mean?" "A man named Ethan Cole contacted my office last month. Said he was Claire's fiancé, said he wanted to understand the estate structure as he was about to become part of the family." A pause. He was very specific. He asked about the terms for accessing trust assets, whether the trust could be dissolved, what would constitute grounds for incapacity removal of a beneficiary. The room was very quiet. He wanted to know if a medical determination of incompetency could override the trust provisions, Grace continued. I told him nothing. He wasn't entitled to anything, and frankly, his questions made my skin crawl. "But I should have called you then. I'm sorry I waited." "How long ago?" 6 weeks. 6 weeks. He'd been researching the trust before he'd even asked me about the property boundaries a 5th time. "Grace," I said, "I need you to reach out to Patricia Wu." "The judge?" "The retired judge. Tell her everything you just told me." The investigator Patricia arranged was named David Marsh. He had the kind of forgettable face that was probably useful in his profession: medium height, medium build, the sort of man you'd look at in a grocery store and immediately forget. He'd spent 22 years with the RCMP before going private, the last decade of his service in financial crimes. He came to the property on a Tuesday while Claire was in Vancouver for work. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and he listened to everything I told him without interrupting. The questions about land value, the research into the trust structure, the questions to the doctor, he said. He'd read the brief Patricia had prepared. This is a documented pattern. Financial predators targeting bereaved families usually identify the asset first, then find the access point. In this case, Claire. What do you need? Permission to install cameras. Kitchen, living room, front entry. He slid a form across the table. This is the BC Privacy Act authorization. Patricia's already reviewed it. Everything we capture is legally admissible. He paused. And I need access to any food or drink Ethan prepares or handles in this house. You think he's planning to drug me? Marsh didn't blink. He researched sedatives with your doctor, asked your estate lawyer about incapacity provisions, and is months away from a wedding that will give him leverage over your daughter. Yes. I think he's in the preparation stage. I signed the authorization form. He installed 3 cameras that afternoon, one behind the windowsill planter above the kitchen sink, one inside the clock on the bookshelf, one in the entry hall smoke detector. He showed me the feed on a tablet, clear, wide angle, silent. You won't see them, he said, but we'll see everything. My family doctor was Dr. Helen Park, who had been looking after me since Thomas died, and who had the quality I valued most in a physician. She treated her patients as intelligent adults. She called me on a Wednesday evening, and something in her tone told me before she spoke a word that the news was not good. Margaret, I need to tell you about a conversation I had 3 weeks ago. I've been sitting on this, and I shouldn't have. Tell me. A man came to the clinic identifying himself as your daughter's fiancé. He said he was concerned about your memory, that you'd been repeating yourself, losing track of conversations, misplacing things. Her voice tightened. I've been your physician for 4 years. You don't have any of those symptoms, not one. What did he ask? The sound of paper shuffling. He asked about the early stages of vascular dementia and how it was diagnosed. He asked about medications that could cause cognitive impairment and whether they'd be detectable in standard blood work. He asked about the legal process for establishing incapacity under the Patients' Property Act in British Columbia. I was quiet for a moment. Helen, what medication specifically did he ask about? Bromazepam. She paused. It's a benzodiazepine. Relatively fast-acting. In higher doses, in someone your age, it can cause significant confusion, loss of coordination, memory impairment. It would look, on observation, a great deal like dementia. I looked at the glass of water on the counter. Ethan had brought it to me at dinner 2 weeks ago. I'd taken 2 sips and then set it down because I'd felt suddenly tired, and I'd assumed I was simply exhausted from a difficult week. Could it be dissolved in a hot or cold liquid? À silence. Yes. And if someone had been documenting my apparent confusion over several weeks, combined with questions to my doctor about dementia, and questions to my estate lawyer about incapacity provisions, it would build a case, Helen said quietly, for stripping you of legal capacity, financial power of attorney, property management. In British Columbia, the bar for that kind of application is not as high as people think. A pause. Margaret, I'm so sorry I didn't call sooner. You're calling now, I said. That's what matters. After we hung up, I stood at the kitchen counter for a long time. I looked at the water glass. Then I poured it down the drain. We set the trap on a Thursday evening in late June, 12 days before the wedding. Patricia, David, Grace, and Helen had met at my property the weekend before to go over every detail. The sheriff's liaison from the local RCMP detachment, a staff sergeant named Kim LaRouche, who Patricia had worked with on a financial exploitation case several years earlier, had reviewed the plan and the evidence and had confirmed that what we had was sufficient for arrest. She wanted one more piece, a direct act. I called Ethan that afternoon with my voice easy and warm. Ethan, I was thinking it would be nice for just the 2 of us to have dinner before the wedding. Get to know each other a little better. You're about to become my family. He agreed immediately. Too quickly. Of course, Margaret. I'd love that. I cooked Thomas's lamb stew, the one I could make without thinking, the recipe I'd followed 100 times on cold Okanagan evenings. My hands moved through it automatically, while my mind ran through the sequence David had outlined. At 7:30, I would excuse myself. Headache, stress, the fatigue of wedding preparations. I would fill a glass of water, leave it on the counter, and go upstairs. I would watch the tablet feed. Whatever happened after that would be captured in full, with audio, on 3 cameras, with chain of custody protocols already arranged with the RCMP. Ethan arrived at 7 with wine he'd brought from a Naramata vineyard, and I thought briefly and painfully how much research he'd done. All of it misdirected, all of it wasted. We ate and talked about the wedding timeline, the catering, the tent that was going up on the lawn. He was charming and warm, and asked about Patricia and Grace in the casual way of a man who wanted to understand their role in my life without appearing to care about their role in my life. Then, right on cue, he circled back. I spoke to a financial advisor colleague in Vancouver about estate optimization, he said, cutting his lamb with precise, unhurried movements. There are some structures that could significantly reduce your tax exposure and simplify administration long-term. I'd love to connect you with him after the wedding. I met his eyes. Grace handles everything for me, but thank you. He smiled. The smile that never arrived in his eyes. At 7:28, I pressed my fingers to my temple and stood. I'm so sorry. The pre-wedding stress. I have a terrible headache. I'm going to lie down for a few minutes. I walked to the sink, filled a glass with water, set it on the counter. Please finish your dinner. Make yourself at home. Of course. Can I get you anything? No, just rest. I walked toward the stairs and climbed slowly until I was out of sight. I moved to the upstairs hallway and opened the tablet. Ethan sat still at the table for 6 seconds. Then he stood, walked to the base of the stairs and listened. Then he walked back into the kitchen. He moved to the counter where I'd left the glass. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and removed a small orange prescription bottle. He did not look at the stairs again. He opened the bottle with practiced efficiency, shook a single pill into his palm, took a spoon from the drawer, not the one I'd used, a clean one from the back, set the pill on the counter's edge, and ground it with the handle of the spoon into a fine white powder. Then he picked up my glass, tipped the powder in, and stirred. 47 seconds, start to finish. He set the spoon in the sink, tucked the bottle back in his jacket, and returned to his seat at the table, smoothing his blazer as if he'd done nothing more than refilled his own glass. My phone buzzed. David, right on schedule. I came downstairs slowly, making my footsteps audible. Feeling any better? Ethan asked. A little. I moved toward the counter. The water glass was exactly where I'd left it. Here. He stood, picked up the glass, brought it to me with a look of such genuine concern that I understood, for the first time and completely, how it was that 2 other women had trusted him. I took the glass. Our fingers touched. Thank you, I said. Then my phone rang, programmed to ring at exactly this moment, Claire's name on the screen. Oh, I'm sorry, it's Claire, I have to take this. I turned my back, wrapped the glass in the dish towel I'd set on the counter, and poured the water carefully down the drain while I pretended to speak. The towel stayed between my hand and the glass. Fingerprints intact. Evidence intact. When I turned back around, Ethan was watching the empty glass with an expression that lasted less than a second before it smoothed back into concern. I should go, he said. Let you rest. I walked him to the door. Watched his taillights disappear into the dark. David was inside within 30 seconds, gloves on, evidence bags open. We got it, he said quietly, holding up his phone. The video played in the kitchen's low light. Clear and silent and complete. Dr. Helen Park's lab results came the next morning. Bromazepam, she said, a significant dose. For someone your age, Margaret, this could have caused severe disorientation, loss of balance, memory impairment. If you'd been alone, if you'd fallen, she stopped. But we have proof, I said. Undeniable proof, she said, and I'll testify to every word. We met in Patricia's home office 5 days before the wedding. Me, Patricia, David, Grace, Helen, and Staff Sergeant Kim LaRouche in plain clothes. David laid the evidence across the conference table with the methodical patience of a man who had spent 2 decades building cases that had to hold in court. Blake's real name, we'd been calling him that in my head for weeks, was Brendan Walsh. He'd changed his name legally in 2020. Before that, he'd been charged in Ontario with investment fraud, a $400,000 scheme targeting retirees through a fake wealth management firm he'd registered in Delaware to give it a veneer of American legitimacy. He'd settled with 3 of the 4 victims before trial and fled before sentencing on the 4th. 2 previous cases David had located through Patricia's network, one in Halifax, the daughter of a recently widowed shipbuilder. Engagement ended after a family estate meeting. The family had paid $180,000 for a quiet separation agreement. One in Calgary, the daughter of a retired oil executive. Same pattern, same timeline, same clean disappearance. Neither family had gone to police. Neither family had known about the other. He'd done his research on Thomas, too. David showed me the file property transfer records pulled from the BC Assessment Authority, a search of Thomas's old company registration, a query to the patent database where Thomas's structural innovations were listed. He'd estimated the estate somewhere in the range of $5 to $8 million based on public records. He had been wrong by several million. Thomas had been careful. The pharmaceutical research he'd done through Dr. Helen Park's clinic, the incapacity questions he'd brought to Grace's office, the repeated questions about the property boundaries, it was all consistent, all preparatory, all pointing toward the same destination, a quiet application to the BC Supreme Court for a declaration of incapacity, backed by documented evidence of confusion that he had intended to create himself. He never touches the money directly, David said. He establishes the legal framework. Power of attorney, incapacity declaration. Then a sympathetic judge sees a confused elderly woman and a concerned new son-in-law. It's a clean exploit. We arrest him now. Staff Sergeant LaRouche said. We have more than enough. I want it done at the wedding, I said. The room went quiet. Claire needs to see it, I said. If we arrest him quietly, she'll spend years wondering if I was wrong, if I was jealous or paranoid. I know my daughter. I looked around the table. She needs the truth in front of witnesses, so there is no version of events where he can reframe this as an overprotective mother. Patricia looked at LaRouche. LaRouche looked at her files. He'll be in plain clothes, LaRouche said finally. 2 officers on the perimeter, David on the access road. The moment you give the signal, we move. What's the signal? David asked. I thought about it. I'll say Thomas's name. The night before the wedding, I drove to the cemetery. Thomas's stone was simple granite with his name and dates, and the single word he'd requested himself. Builder. I sat in the grass beside it and told him everything. The investigation, the cameras, Brendan Walsh's real name, the 2 women before Claire, the bromazepam dissolved in my water glass, the plan for tomorrow. You would have seen it immediately, I said. You always spotted the ones who were looking at the exits. The Okanagan summer evening was warm and soft, the lake visible in the distance, turning silver in the fading light. An owl called from somewhere in the trees above the cemetery. I'm protecting what you built, I said. All of it. The land and everything beyond the land. I stayed until dark. Then I drove home and slept better than I had in months. July 12th arrived with a sky so blue it hurt to look at. By noon, the tent was full of white chairs and wildflowers, and 90 guests had begun to arrive on the lawn in the long afternoon light. The lake spread below us, silver and still. Thomas had once said that on days like this, the Okanagan looked like somewhere a person had invented to describe heaven. I helped Claire with her buttons in her old childhood bedroom. She wore simple ivory silk, her dark hair up. She was beautiful in the way that had nothing to do with the dress. Mom, she said. Her voice had changed. I need to tell you something. I looked at her in the mirror. Her hands were trembling. She turned to face me and reached into the fold of her dress and placed a small note in my palm. 3 words in her handwriting. Mom, help me. She told me what she'd heard. She'd gone to Ethan's hotel room Wednesday night to surprise him. The door had been ajar. She'd stood in the hallway and listened for 2 minutes before she'd understood what she was hearing. Ethan and a man she didn't recognize, going through a timeline, discussing documents, discussing her, discussing me. The phrase that had locked into her memory and wouldn't leave, the old woman won't know what's wrong with her until it's too late. She'd gone home. She'd spent 2 days alone with the information, trying to find an explanation that wasn't what it obviously was. Then she'd written me the note. I was afraid, she said. I was afraid you'd think I was overreacting. I was afraid if I was wrong, I'd have destroyed something for nothing. Tears on her face now, careful and controlled. And I was afraid that if I was right, it meant that none of it was real. None of it was real, I said gently. Not his name, not his history, not a word of it. I told her everything. Every piece of it, briefly, Clearly, the way I used to brief a jury in a complex fraud case. His real name, the 2 women before her, the bromazepam in the water glass, the cameras, the lab results, Patricia, David, Grace, Helen, Staff Sergeant LaRouche in the 3rd row. Claire stood very still through all of it. "You've known for weeks," she said. "I needed proof you couldn't argue with." She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. Then she straightened her shoulders in the exact way Thomas used to straighten his before he walked into a difficult meeting. "What do I do?" "Walk down the aisle," I said. "When the officiant asks if anyone objects, I'll stand. But I want you beside me when I do." She nodded once. "Tell me exactly what to say." The string quartet played as we walked down the aisle together, her hand in the crook of my arm. The guests turned and smiled. Brendan Walsh stood at the altar in his perfect suit with the man Claire had described his associate, who'd been introduced to everyone as an old friend beside him. I scanned the rows as we walked. Patricia at the far end, 2nd row. Helen toward the front with her bag at her feet. Grace near the aisle. Staff Sergeant LaRouche, unremarkable in a blue summer suit. 3rd row, aisle seat. 2 officers I'd been briefed on somewhere in the crowd. David would be on the perimeter. He'd been briefed on the exits. We reached the altar. Brendan's smile was everything it had always been practiced. Warm, perfectly calibrated. He took Claire's hand and turned toward the officiant. The ceremony moved through its traditional language. I sat in the front row, hands folded, breathing evenly. 40 years of courtrooms had made me capable of waiting. And then, if anyone here knows of any lawful reason why these 2 should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace. I stood. The silence was immediate and complete. Every face turned toward me. "I'm sorry to do this here," I said, and I meant it. "But this is the only way my daughter will never have to wonder." I turned to Claire. She turned to face the guests, spine straight, chin up. In a clear, steady voice, she told them what she'd heard through a hotel door. The timeline, the plan, the phrase about the old woman, every word of it. Brendan moved toward her. "Claire, sweetheart, his name is not Ethan Cole," I said. "It's Brendan Walsh. He was charged with investment fraud in Ontario in 2019, involving $400,000 stolen from retirees. He fled before sentencing. He has done this twice before, once in Halifax, once in Calgary. Both times, he targeted women whose fathers had died recently, got engaged to their daughters, researched their family estates, and then disappeared when the families paid to make him go away quietly." The crowd was very still. "He visited my doctor to research medications that would make me appear to have dementia," I continued. "He asked my estate lawyer how to invoke incapacity provisions under the Patients' Property Act. And 11 days ago, he crushed a sedative into a glass of water and handed it to me with great concern and encouraged me to drink it." I looked at him steadily. "We have all of it on video," I said. "We have the laboratory analysis. We have the documentation. And now we have 90 witnesses." "Thomas," I said clearly. Staff Sergeant Kim LaRouche stood from the 3rd row. The rest moved quickly and without drama, the way justice usually does when it is properly prepared. Brendan Walsh was handcuffed in front of 90 guests on a July afternoon on a property that Thomas Caldwell had built 28 years ago, under a blue Okanagan sky that seemed to go on forever. His associate ran and got 15 feet before David Marsh was there. The patrol car pulled away down the gravel drive. The wildflowers on the altar swayed in the lake breeze. And for the first time in months, I breathed without holding anything back. Claire and I sat on the porch steps as the evening came in, still in our clothes, with tea instead of wedding champagne. The guests had gone home slowly, kindly, with the particular tenderness that people offer when they've witnessed something difficult. "I keep thinking about the other 2, Claire said. "The women in Halifax and Calgary." "They're going to testify," I said. Patricia reached them. They agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "Did any of it feel real to you? At the beginning?" I thought about Thanksgiving, the wine from Naramata, the questions about Thomas, the way he'd helped clear the table. "He was very good," I said. But nothing he said about Thomas felt quite right. He talked about him like a subject he'd researched, rather than a person he was sorry to have missed. That's the thing about people who are performing. They get the facts right, but the feeling wrong. Claire leaned her head on my shoulder. "Your father would have spotted it in 5 minutes," I said. "You spotted it in 6 weeks," she said. "I think that counts." December arrived, and with it, the first real snow on the orchard. Claire had moved back to the property for the autumn. She was seeing a therapist in Kelowna who specialized in relationship trauma. She was making slow and real progress. Some weeks were better than others. The day she walked into town for coffee with a schoolteacher she'd met through Patricia's neighbor, and came home with color in her cheeks for the first time in months. I counted it as a very good week. Brendan Walsh was awaiting trial on multiple charges: fraud, attempted drugging, identity falsification, and charges related to the outstanding Ontario warrant. His associate was charged as an accessory. The Halifax and Calgary families had engaged their own counsel and were pursuing civil claims. Patricia expected both criminal trials to result in conviction. Grace had reviewed the trust. Everything Thomas had put in place held exactly as he'd intended. Thomas had known that grief made people vulnerable long before he had any reason to think about it personally. He'd built the legal structure for our protection the same way he'd built load-bearing walls, not because he expected them to be tested, but because he understood that good structure was the thing that held when everything else failed. I told Claire the full estate picture: that December, the numbers, the trust terms, the value Thomas had built quietly over 4 decades. She sat with it for a long time. "He never told me," she said. "He was afraid it would change things for you. He wanted you to build your own life first." I poured more tea. "He wanted you to know who you were before you knew what you had." She looked out the window at the orchard, bare and snow-covered and waiting for spring. "It almost did change things," she said quietly. "Just not the way he was afraid of." "It changed things for the right reason," I said. "It showed us what we'd protect for each other." She turned back to me. For a moment, she looked exactly as she had at 7 years old, sitting in this same kitchen, watching me with complete trust. "I'm glad you trusted your instincts, Mom." "I almost didn't," I said honestly. "I almost told myself I was being a difficult woman, an overprotective widow who couldn't let her daughter be happy. I've seen that happen to other women, the ones who talked themselves out of what they knew." "What stopped you?" I thought of Thomas in the long grass with the pruning shears, of his voice at the kitchen table explaining the trust provisions with the same careful patience he gave every load-bearing calculation, of the reading glasses still on his desk. "Your father built this for us," I said. "I wasn't going to let someone else dismantle it." The snow fell quietly on the orchard. The lake, just visible through the bare apple trees, held the last of the winter light. The house was warm behind us, full of Thomas's careful blueprints and his old work boots and his coffee mug that said simply TC. Engineering from a conference he'd attended years ago and that I had never been able to put away. We sat together in the quiet until the stars came out. Some things don't need protecting because they're worth money. They need protecting because they're worth everything else. Thomas had understood that. Now so did Claire. And as for the people who see a grieving family and calculate what they might take, they never account for what they can't see on any assessment or title register or estate document. They can't see what a family is willing to do for each other. That, in the end, is what they always get wrong.